When Sophia Chen stumbled out of the Olympic wilderness after 5 years, her first desperate words weren't relief or gratitude, but a terrified plea. "Don't tell anyone you found me, or they'll kill my family." The sister who had vanished with Maya on what should have been a simple 3-day hike had returned alone, carrying secrets so dangerous that she had chosen to live like a ghost in the forest, rather than risk exposing the truth about what they had discovered in those remote mountains. The morning air carried a crisp edge that promised autumn was coming to the Pacific Northwest, though the calendar still showed late August 2019. Maya Chen stood in the driveway of her parents' suburban Seattle home, methodically checking her backpack for the 3rd time. At 24, she had developed the careful habits of an experienced hiker, the kind of attention to detail that had kept her safe through dozens of wilderness adventures. Her younger sister Sophia bounced on her toes beside Maya's Honda Civic, her nervous energy a sharp contrast to Maya's deliberate preparation. At 21, Sophia possessed an infectious enthusiasm that could light up any room, but also a tendency to rush headlong into adventures without considering all the risks. Maya had learned to be the cautious one, the planner, the sister who made sure they always had enough water and emergency supplies. "Did you remember the water purification tablets?" Maya asked, zipping up the main compartment of her blue backpack. She had given Sophia an identical pack for her 20th birthday, reasoning that matching gear would make it easier to keep track of their supplies on the trail. Sophia held up a small plastic bottle with a grin. "Already packed, along with the backup batteries for our headlamps and that terrible freeze-dried mac and cheese you insisted we bring." She wrinkled her nose in mock disgust, though they both knew she would be grateful for the hot meal after a long day of hiking. Their father David emerged from the house carrying 2 steaming travel mugs, his face showing the mixture of pride and worry that had become familiar whenever his daughters announced another wilderness expedition. As an accountant, he understood the importance of careful planning, but he also knew that no amount of preparation could account for every variable in the unforgiving landscape of Olympic National Park. "The weather forecast looks good for the next 3 days, he said, handing each daughter a mug of coffee. "But you know how quickly conditions can change in the mountains. Promise me you'll turn back if anything feels wrong." Maya accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic. "Dad, we've been planning this trip for months. We know the route, we have all the right gear, and we filed our backcountry permit yesterday. The Sol Duc River Trail is well marked, and we'll be back Sunday evening just like we promised." Their mother, Lynn, appeared in the doorway, still wearing her nurse's scrubs from the night shift at Harborview Medical Center. She had driven straight home to see her daughters off, despite being exhausted from 12 hours of caring for patients in the intensive care unit. The worry lines around her eyes had deepened over the years as Maya and Sophia pursued increasingly ambitious hiking goals. "I know you're both experienced," Lynn said, walking over to embrace each daughter in turn, "but you're my babies, and I can't help worrying when you disappear into the wilderness for days at a time. Just promise me you'll stick together, no matter what." Sophia laughed and squeezed her mother tightly. "Mom, we're not going to get separated. Maya would probably tie a rope between us if she thought there was any chance of that happening." Maya smiled at the joke, but privately she thought it wasn't such a bad idea. The Olympic wilderness was vast and unforgiving, a place where even experienced hikers could become disoriented in the dense forest or lose their way in sudden weather changes. She had read enough search and rescue reports to know that most tragedies began with simple mistakes, small decisions that seemed reasonable at the time but led to catastrophic consequences. After loading their packs into the car, Maya hugged her parents one final time. The morning sun was climbing higher, and they needed to reach the trailhead by mid-morning to have enough daylight for the first day's hike to Blue Lake. As they drove away, David and Lynn waved from the driveway, watching until the Honda disappeared around the corner. None of them knew it would be the last time they would all be together as a complete family. The Sol Duc River Trail stretched ahead like a green tunnel, cathedral arches of ancient Douglas fir and western hemlock, creating a natural canopy that filtered the morning sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. Maya and Sophia Chen had signed in at the ranger station at 8:30 that morning, their backcountry permit officially recorded for a 3-day loop that would take them deep into some of the most remote wilderness in Olympic National Park. The sisters moved at a steady pace along the well-maintained trail, their matching blue backpacks bobbing rhythmically as they navigated the gentle inclines and switchbacks that followed the rushing Sol Duc River. The sound of moving water provided a constant soundtrack, sometimes a gentle murmur when the river meandered through quiet pools, sometimes a thunderous roar where it cascaded over moss-covered boulders in a series of small waterfalls. Sophia pulled out her phone every few hundred yards, snapping photos of particularly striking views and recording short videos that she planned to edit into a highlights reel when they returned home. Maya had initially protested the constant documentation, preferring to experience the wilderness without the distraction of social media, but she had to admit that Sophia had an eye for capturing the raw beauty of the Olympic Peninsula. "Look at this," Sophia called out, stopping at a wooden bridge that spanned a deep gorge where the river had carved through volcanic rock over thousands of years. She positioned her phone to capture both sisters with the dramatic backdrop of rushing water and towering evergreens. "This is going to get so many likes when I post it." Maya joined her sister on the bridge, but her attention was focused on the map and compass in her hands rather than the phone camera. They had covered approximately 4 miles since leaving the trailhead, making good time despite Sophia's frequent photo stops. According to her calculations, they should reach the junction for the Blue Lake Trail within the next hour, where they would leave the main Sol Duc corridor and venture into true backcountry. The transition from day hiking trail to wilderness route was marked by a subtle but noticeable change in the character of the forest. The path became narrower and less defined, requiring more careful navigation around fallen logs and through dense patches of undergrowth. The sounds of other hikers, which had been a constant presence along the popular Sol Duc Trail, gradually faded until the sisters found themselves completely alone in the vast green silence of the Olympic wilderness. As they climbed steadily toward Blue Lake, the forest began to open up, revealing glimpses of the dramatic peaks that formed the heart of the Olympic Mountains. Maya consulted her topographic map regularly, checking their progress against known landmarks and ensuring they stayed on the correct route. The trail was marked with occasional blazes carved into tree trunks, but in some sections it was little more than a faint depression in the forest floor, easily lost if a hiker wasn't paying careful attention. By late afternoon they crested a small ridge and caught their first glimpse of Blue Lake, a pristine alpine tarn that reflected the surrounding peaks like a perfect mirror. The designated camping area sat on a small promontory overlooking the water, surrounded by scattered boulders and stunted mountain hemlocks that had somehow found purchase in the thin mountain soil. "This is perfect," Sophia breathed, dropping her pack and immediately reaching for her camera again. The late afternoon light was turning the lake's surface into liquid gold, and the reflection of the mountains created an almost surreal doubling effect that made it difficult to tell where reality ended and reflection began. Maya nodded in agreement as she began the familiar ritual of setting up their campsite, but she also felt the subtle weight of isolation settling around them. They were now more than 8 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by hundreds of square miles of untracked wilderness. It was exactly the kind of pristine solitude they had been seeking, but it also meant they were completely dependent on their own skills and preparation for the next 48 hours. Sunday evening arrived with the kind of Pacific Northwest drizzle that turned the windows of the Chen family home into streaked watercolors, blurring the streetlights into soft halos of yellow light. David Chen stood at the kitchen window, checking his watch for the dozenth time in the past hour. 6:45. Maya had promised they would be home by 6:30 at the latest, allowing for traffic and the drive back from Olympic National Park. Lynn emerged from the living room where she had been folding laundry, a task that usually helped calm her nerves but had proven useless tonight. She moved to stand beside her husband, both of them staring out at the empty driveway where Maya's Honda Civic should have been parked by now. "Maybe they decided to stay an extra night," Lynn said, though her voice carried no conviction. She knew her daughters too well. Maya never changed plans without calling, and Sophia would never let her phone battery die without finding a way to send at least a quick text message. David pulled his cell phone from his pocket and tried Maya's number again. The call went straight to voicemail, just as it had the previous 6 times he had tried. Sophia's phone did the same thing, that cheerful recorded greeting now sounding almost mocking in its upbeat tone. He left another message, trying to keep his voice steady and casual, asking them to call as soon as they got the message. The rational part of his mind offered reasonable explanations. Cell service in Olympic National Park was notoriously unreliable, especially in the remote backcountry areas where his daughters preferred to hike. They could have encountered bad weather and decided to wait it out in their tent. They might have taken a wrong turn and needed extra time to find their way back to the trailhead. Maya's car could have broken down, leaving them stranded but safe while they waited for help. But David's parental instincts, finely tuned by 24 years of watching over Maya and 21 years of worrying about Sophia's impulsive nature, were sending different signals entirely. His daughters were responsible. They understood that their parents would worry. They would have found a way to communicate, even if it meant hiking back to an area with cell coverage just to send a quick message. By 8 o'clock, Lynn had given up any pretense of normal Sunday evening activities. She sat at the kitchen table with Maya's detailed trip plans spread out in front of her, studying the hand-drawn route as if it might reveal some clue about where her daughters could be. Maya had left copies of everything: topographic maps with their intended camping spots marked in red ink, a list of emergency contacts, even the permit number they had received from the National Park Service. "I'm calling the ranger station," David announced, reaching for the phone book to find the number for Olympic National Park headquarters. His hands shook slightly as he dialed, and when the automated system answered, he pressed 0 repeatedly until he reached a human voice. The ranger who answered was polite but not particularly concerned. Late hikers were a common occurrence, especially during the busy summer season. Weather in the mountains could change rapidly, forcing people to alter their plans. Most overdue hikers showed up within 24 hours, with perfectly reasonable explanations for their delay. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from. David provided Maya and Sophia's names, their permit number, and their planned route. The ranger promised to pass the information along to the appropriate personnel and suggested the family call back in the morning if the sisters still had not returned. It was standard procedure, he explained, professional and measured. But as David hung up the phone and looked at his wife's frightened face, he knew with growing certainty that something was wrong. The house felt different now, charged with an anxiety that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. The normal sounds of evening, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic on the main road, seemed muffled and strange. The silence from Olympic National Park was becoming deafening, and with each passing hour, the Chen family's world was quietly beginning to collapse. The call came at 6:15 Monday morning, jolting David Chen from a restless sleep filled with dreams of his daughters lost in endless green corridors of forest. Ranger Tom Mitchell, from Olympic National Park's Emergency Services Division, spoke in the calm, measured tones of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to worried families. "Mr. Chen, we're initiating a search and rescue operation for your daughters this morning. I need you to understand that this is standard procedure when hikers are overdue, but we're taking it very seriously." David sat up in bed, Lynn stirring beside him as she registered the change in his voice. "What does that mean exactly? How many people are we talking about?" "We're deploying 2 ground teams of 6 searchers each, plus our helicopter crew when the weather clears. The forecast shows low clouds this morning, but visibility should improve by noon." Mitchell paused, the sound of radio chatter audible in the background. "I want to be clear about something, Mr. Chen. The Sol Duc area is challenging terrain, but your daughters filed a detailed itinerary and they're experienced hikers. Most of these situations resolve within the first 24 hours. By 7:30 that morning, the first search teams were assembling at the Sol Duc Hot Springs parking area, the same trailhead where Maya and Sophia had begun their journey 4 days earlier. The operation was coordinated by veteran search and rescue specialist Karen Reeves, a woman whose 20-year career had taken her into every corner of Olympic National Park's 922,000 acres. Reeves spread a laminated topographic map across the hood of her truck, using a red marker to trace the sisters' planned route, while the assembled searchers gathered around. The primary team would follow the Sol Duc River Trail to the Blue Lake Junction, then continue to the camping area where Maya and Sophia should have spent their first night. A second team would take the high route along the ridge above the lake, checking for any sign that the sisters might have wandered off the established trail. "Weather conditions have been stable for the past week," Reeves explained, her breath visible in the cool morning air. "No sudden storms, no flash flooding. Temperatures have stayed moderate. If they're injured or lost, they should still be mobile and able to respond to our calls." The helicopter, a bright orange Bell 206 operated by the National Park Service, lifted off from Port Angeles at 10:15, its pilot navigating carefully through the broken cloud cover that hung over the Olympic Mountains. From 500 feet above the forest canopy, the terrain revealed itself as an almost impenetrable maze of ridges, valleys, and dense vegetation that could easily hide 2 people, even if they were trying to be found. The first radio report came at noon. Team Alpha had reached Blue Lake and located the designated camping area without finding any trace of the missing hikers. No tent sites showed recent use, no fire rings contained fresh ash, no food scraps or equipment had been left behind. It was as if Maya and Sophia had never reached their intended destination. Team Bravo, working the ridge above the lake, reported similar findings. The trail showed signs of regular use by hikers and pack animals, but no specific evidence that could be linked to the Chen sisters. The helicopter crew completed 3 separate grid patterns over the search area, their thermal imaging equipment detecting several elk and a black bear, but no human heat signatures. By late afternoon, the search had expanded beyond the sisters' planned route. Teams began checking alternate trails and unofficial paths that branched off from the main Sol Duc corridor, following game trails and old mining roads that didn't appear on standard hiking maps. The helicopter crew extended their search pattern to include the Ho River drainage and the remote valleys that lay between the major trail systems. As darkness approached, Ranger Mitchell made the decision to suspend aerial operations but continue limited ground searches through the night. Powerful LED searchlights swept through the forest as teams called out the sisters' names, their voices echoing off the mountain walls before being swallowed by the vast silence of the wilderness. The first day of searching had yielded no trace of Maya and Sophia Chen, no clues about where they might have gone or what might have happened to them. The Olympic wilderness, which had seemed like a peaceful refuge when the sisters set out on their adventure, was beginning to reveal its true nature as a place vast enough to hide almost anything, and indifferent enough to keep its secrets forever. The breakthrough came on Wednesday morning when Search Team Alpha finally located what they had been desperately seeking for 3 days. Hidden in a grove of ancient cedars on the eastern shore of Blue Lake, approximately 200 yards from the designated camping area, they found an established campsite that showed clear signs of recent occupation. Ranger Tom Mitchell received the radio call at 8:45, the excited voice of team leader Jake Morrison crackling through the static. "Base, this is Alpha Team. We've got something here. Requesting immediate backup and the crime scene kit. This isn't what we expected." Mitchell grabbed his emergency pack and hiked the 5 miles to Blue Lake in record time, his heart pounding from both exertion and anticipation. When he arrived at the site, he understood immediately why Morrison had requested additional resources. The scene before him was both reassuring and deeply disturbing, a puzzle that raised more questions than it answered. A blue dome tent, identical to the one Maya Chen had purchased 3 months earlier, stood perfectly erected between 2 massive cedar trunks. The rainfly was properly secured, guy lines taut, the entrance zipped shut against weather and animals. Inside, 2 sleeping bags were laid out side by side, still bearing the impressions of bodies that had recently occupied them. Personal clothing was neatly folded and placed in the tent's corner pockets. Outside the tent, a metal fire ring contained the cold remains of what appeared to be a recent campfire. Scattered around the ring were the remnants of freeze-dried meals, the same brands and flavors that David Chen had helped his daughters pack 4 days earlier. A small camp stove sat on a flat boulder, its fuel canister still partially full. What made the scene so unsettling was not what was there, but how it was arranged. Everything suggested a normal camping experience that had been interrupted suddenly, but not violently. There were no signs of struggle, no scattered equipment, no indication that the occupants had fled in panic or been forced to leave against their will. Morrison, a 15-year veteran of wilderness search and rescue, had seen dozens of abandoned campsites over his career. Usually they told clear stories, equipment scattered by wind or animals, tents collapsed by weather, food containers torn open by bears or other wildlife. This site was different. It looked as if the occupants had simply stepped away for a moment and would return at any time. Mitchell began a systematic inventory of the items left behind. Maya's distinctive red backpack sat propped against a tree, its contents apparently undisturbed. Sophia's blue pack was nearby, her camera and phone visible in the outside pockets. Both phones showed dead batteries, their screens dark and unresponsive to attempts to power them on. The discovery that troubled Mitchell most was the condition of the sisters' hiking boots. Both pairs sat neatly beside the tent entrance, laces loosened as if their owners had simply kicked them off after a long day on the trail. But the boots showed heavy wear patterns and embedded dirt that suggested extensive hiking, far more than would be expected from a single day's journey to Blue Lake. A careful search of the surrounding area revealed additional puzzling details. Faint paths led away from the campsite in multiple directions, worn trails that didn't appear on any official map. Some headed toward the lakeshore, others disappeared into dense forest that would be nearly impossible to navigate without proper equipment and experience. Most disturbing was a series of marks carved into the bark of a large cedar tree near the tent. The cuts were fresh, made with a sharp knife, but they formed no recognizable pattern or message. They looked almost like tally marks, as if someone had been counting days or events, but the meaning remained completely unclear. Mitchell carefully photographed every aspect of the scene before disturbing anything. The campsite would need to be processed by trained investigators, every item tagged and removed for analysis. But even as he documented the evidence, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real answers lay not in what the sisters had left behind, but in understanding why they had chosen to leave it in the first place. The tent and its contents offered proof that Maya and Sophia had made it safely to Blue Lake, but they also raised a terrifying new question. If the sisters had reached their destination and established a secure campsite, what had convinced them to abandon everything and walk away into the vast Olympic wilderness? The transition from search and rescue to criminal investigation happened with bureaucratic efficiency that belied the emotional weight of the decision. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived at Olympic National Park headquarters on Thursday morning, her unmarked sedan looking distinctly out of place among the ranger vehicles and emergency response trucks that filled the parking lot. Martinez had spent 12 years with the Clallam County Sheriff's Office, the last 5 specializing in missing persons cases that crossed the boundary between wilderness emergencies and potential crimes. She understood that the Olympic Peninsula's vast forests could swallow people whole, but she also knew that not every disappearance in the wilderness was the result of getting lost or injured. Her first meeting was with Ranger Tom Mitchell, whose detailed documentation of the Blue Lake campsite had convinced his supervisors that outside expertise was needed. Mitchell spread the crime scene photographs across a conference table, pointing out the anomalies that had troubled him since discovering the site. "The thing that bothers me most," Mitchell explained, "is how organized everything was. In my experience, when hikers get into trouble, they don't take time to pack up their campsite neatly. They grab what they need and go, leaving everything else behind." Martinez studied the photographs carefully. The tent's perfect setup, the neatly arranged personal items, the absence of any signs of panic or haste. It suggested either extraordinary calm in the face of an emergency or sufficient time to prepare for a planned departure. Neither scenario fit with the standard explanations for wilderness disappearances. Her next stop was the Chen family home in Seattle, where she found David and Lynn Chen existing in a state of suspended animation. The house felt frozen in time, as if normal life had stopped the moment their daughters failed to return from their hiking trip. Photographs of Maya and Sophia covered every surface, and detailed maps of Olympic National Park were spread across the dining room table. "Tell me about their hiking experience," Martinez asked, settling into the living room where the family had gathered countless times to plan outdoor adventures. "How well did they know the Olympic wilderness?" Lynn answered first, her voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in her face. Maya had been hiking since she was 12. She knew those trails better than most park rangers. Sophia was newer to serious backpacking, but she was strong, and Maya was always very careful about not taking unnecessary risks. David pulled out a thick binder, filled with trip reports, photographs, and maps from previous hiking adventures. Maya documented everything. Every trail they'd hiked, every campsite they'd used, weather conditions, gear that worked or didn't work. She treated hiking like a science. Martinez flipped through the binder, noting the meticulous attention to detail in Maya's handwritten reports. Route descriptions included precise mileages, elevation gains, and potential hazards. Gear lists were updated after each trip based on what had proven useful or unnecessary. This was not the record-keeping of someone prone to impulsive decisions or poor judgment in the wilderness. The detective's most important interview was with Tommy Brewster, a park maintenance worker who had been conducting trail repairs near the Sol Duc hot springs the morning Maya and Sophia began their hike. Brewster remembered the sisters clearly, partly because of their obvious enthusiasm and partly because of an unusual conversation they'd had about unofficial trails. They asked about waterfalls that weren't marked on the park maps, Brewster recalled, sitting in Martinez's car while rain drummed against the windshield. Specifically, they wanted to know about hidden spots that most tourists never see. I told them about a few places, off-trail stuff that requires some scrambling but leads to really spectacular views. Brewster's description of these hidden locations sent a chill through Martinez. The areas he described were miles from any established trail, in terrain that would be nearly impossible to navigate without extensive wilderness experience. More troubling was his observation that the sisters had seemed particularly interested in routes that would take them away from areas frequented by other hikers. "Did they mention why they wanted to find isolated spots?" Martinez asked. The older sister, Maya, said something about wanting to photograph places that hadn't been posted on social media 1,000 times already. She seemed frustrated with how crowded the popular trails had become, said she was looking for authentic wilderness experience. That evening, Martinez sat in her hotel room reviewing her notes and trying to construct a timeline that made sense. Maya and Sophia had clearly reached Blue Lake and established their campsite. The evidence suggested they had stayed at least one night, possibly 2. Then, for reasons that remained completely unclear, they had left their tent and most of their equipment behind and ventured into some of the most remote terrain in Olympic National Park. The question that haunted Martinez was whether they had made that decision voluntarily, or if something had forced them to abandon their safe campsite and flee into the wilderness. The careful organization of their abandoned gear suggested planning rather than panic, but the detective had learned to be suspicious of scenes that appeared too neat, too controlled. As she prepared her preliminary report, Martinez made a decision that would reshape the entire investigation. She recommended that the case be officially reclassified from a missing persons search to a potential homicide investigation, acknowledging that Maya and Sophia Chen might not simply be lost in the Olympic wilderness, but might instead be victims of a crime that had been carefully concealed in one of the most remote locations in the continental United States. The silence in the Chen household had weight, pressing down on every conversation and filling the spaces between words with unspoken fears. 2 weeks after Maya and Sophia's disappearance, the family's carefully constructed routines had collapsed entirely, replaced by a strange new rhythm of police calls, search updates, and the endless waiting that comes with having no answers. David had taken indefinite leave from his accounting firm, a decision that his supervisor accepted with the kind of awkward sympathy reserved for tragedies that no one knows how to discuss. His days now revolved around coordination calls with Detective Martinez, organizing volunteer search parties, and maintaining the detailed spreadsheets that tracked every lead, every searcher, every square mile of terrain that had been covered without yielding any trace of his daughters. The dining room table had been transformed into a command center, covered with laminated topographic maps marked with colored pins representing search areas, witness interviews, and potential sightings. David found himself obsessing over these maps late into the night, tracing possible routes with his finger as if the right combination of logic and determination could somehow reveal where Maya and Sophia had gone. Lynn's response to the crisis had been different but equally consuming. She had thrown herself into researching other missing persons cases, spending hours on internet forums dedicated to unsolved disappearances. Her browser history had become a catalog of heartbreak, filled with stories of families who had been searching for missing loved ones for years or decades without resolution. There's a woman in Colorado whose daughter disappeared in Rocky Mountain National Park in 2015. Lynn announced over breakfast, her laptop open beside her untouched coffee. They found her car at a trailhead, but no trace of her on any of the trails. The family hired private investigators, brought in psychics, even used cadaver dogs. Nothing. David looked up from his own laptop, where he was reviewing the latest weather reports from Olympic National Park. Lynn, I don't think reading about other cases is helping. We need to focus on Maya and Sophia, not on disasters that happen to other families. But don't you see, Lynn continued, her voice taking on the intense quality it had developed over the past 2 weeks. These cases follow patterns, young women disappearing in national parks. No signs of struggle, no logical explanation for why they would leave established trails. There has to be a connection. The strain was beginning to show in other ways. David had lost 15 pounds, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to shrink a little more each day. Lynn had developed a nervous habit of checking her phone every few minutes, as if the next call or text might somehow bring news that would make sense of their nightmare. Their marriage, built on 26 years of shared experiences and mutual support, was being tested in ways they had never imagined. They found themselves snapping at each other over trivial decisions, their grief expressing itself as irritation when one forgot to buy milk or left dishes in the sink. The normal give and take of domestic life felt impossible when their entire world had been reduced to the single overwhelming question of what had happened to their children. Friends and extended family tried to help, bringing meals and offering to assist with search efforts, but their presence often made things worse. Well, meaning relatives would suggest that maybe the sisters had simply decided to extend their trip, or that they might have met someone and lost track of time. These optimistic scenarios, intended to provide comfort, instead felt like denial of the growing evidence that something truly terrible had occurred. The worst moments came in the middle of the night, when both parents would wake from dreams filled with images of their daughters calling for help from some unreachable place. Lynn had taken to walking the halls of their house at 3 a.m, checking Maya and Sophia's empty bedrooms as if she might somehow find them sleeping peacefully in their childhood beds. David's response was to throw himself even deeper into the search coordination, making lists of additional areas to explore and reaching out to every hiking group and outdoor club in the Pacific Northwest. He had become convinced that the answer lay in finding the right piece of information, the crucial detail that would unlock the mystery of where his daughters had gone. Detective Martinez had warned them that missing persons investigations could take months or even years to resolve, but neither parent was prepared for the psychological toll of existing in a state of permanent uncertainty. They were trapped between hope and despair, unable to grieve properly because they didn't know if their daughters were dead, and unable to move forward because they didn't know if Maya and Sophia might still need rescuing. The Chen family was discovering that some silences are louder than any scream, and that the absence of answers can be more devastating than the worst possible truth. The first online post appeared on Reddit's Missing Persons subreddit, 3 days after Maya and Sophia Chen's disappearance made local news. A user named PNW Acre posted a detailed summary of the case, complete with photographs from the sisters' social media accounts and a map showing their planned route through Olympic National Park. Within hours, the post had generated dozens of comments and been shared across multiple platforms. Facebook groups dedicated to hiking safety picked up the story. True crime podcasters began discussing the case on their shows. Twitter users with large followings shared the sisters' photographs with increasingly urgent appeals for information. By the end of the first week, 3 separate Facebook groups had formed specifically to coordinate amateur investigation efforts. The largest, called Find Maya and Sophia Chen, attracted over 5,000 members in its first 48 hours. The group's moderators, strangers who had never met the Chen family, established strict rules about posting verified information only and avoiding speculation that might interfere with official search efforts. But rules proved difficult to enforce as the case captured imaginations across the internet. Amateur detectives began analyzing every photograph the sisters had posted on social media, searching for background details that might provide clues about their disappearance. Sophia's Instagram account, which documented their hiking adventures over the past 2 years, became a digital crime scene, subjected to forensic-level scrutiny. One popular theory emerged from a photograph Sophia had posted 6 months earlier during a day hike in the Cascade Mountains. Several forum users claimed to have identified a figure in the distant background, partially obscured by trees, who appeared to be watching the sisters. The image was enhanced, cropped, and analyzed until it became a pixelated Rorschach test that different users interpreted as everything from an innocent fellow hiker to a potential stalker. A particularly active forum member going by the username Trail Detective created detailed timelines of the sisters' movements, cross-referencing their social media posts with weather data, park service reports, and satellite imagery. Their analysis included elaborate theories about alternate routes the sisters might have taken and potential explanations for why they had abandoned their campsite at Blue Lake. David Chen discovered these online communities during his 3rd sleepless night of searching the internet for any mention of his daughters. Initially, he was grateful for the attention and energy focused on finding Maya and Sophia. The dedication of complete strangers who were volunteering their time and expertise felt like a lifeline in the ocean of official procedures and bureaucratic delays. But as he delved deeper into the forums, David began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with how his daughters' lives were being dissected by people who had never met them. Their private moments, captured in casual photographs and social media posts, were being analyzed like evidence in a criminal trial. Innocent family details were being twisted into sinister implications by users convinced they had uncovered hidden meanings in routine hiking photographs. Lynn had a different reaction to the online attention. She found comfort in the community of strangers who shared her obsession with finding answers. She began spending hours each day reading every post, following every lead, and contributing her own insights about her daughters' personalities and habits. The forums became her primary social interaction, replacing real-world relationships that had become too difficult to maintain. The phenomenon reached a disturbing peak when several users began showing up at Olympic National Park, conducting their own unauthorized searches based on theories developed in online discussions. Park rangers found themselves dealing with untrained volunteers who were potentially contaminating evidence and putting themselves at risk in dangerous terrain. Detective Martinez watched the online circus with growing frustration. While she appreciated the public interest in the case, she also understood that internet speculation was creating false leads and unrealistic expectations about what investigators could accomplish. The signal-to-noise ratio was becoming impossible to manage, with genuine tips buried under an avalanche of amateur theories. The Chen family was learning that the internet's power to mobilize support came with an unexpected cost. Their private tragedy had become public entertainment, their daughters transformed from real people into characters in a narrative that seemed independent of the search for truth. The tip line established for Maya and Sophia Chen's disappearance generated its first call within hours of the case making regional news. Detective Martinez had expected some public response, but nothing prepared her for the deluge that followed. By the end of September 2019, her voicemail was overwhelmed with reports from across the Pacific Northwest, each caller convinced they had seen the missing sisters. The first promising lead came from a timber worker near Mount Baker who called to report 2 young women matching Maya and Sophia's description at a remote gas station. Martinez drove 3 hours through winding mountain roads, her hopes rising with each mile. The gas station owner was helpful and certain about what he had seen, But security footage from the date in question showed two completely different women who bore only a superficial resemblance to the Chen sisters. A week later, a hiker called from the Olympic Hot Springs Trail, claiming to have encountered two women who seemed disoriented and asked unusual questions about finding their way back to civilization. The description was compelling enough to prompt a ground search of the area, with teams spending 2 days combing trails and interviewing other hikers. The search yielded nothing, and follow-up investigation revealed that the reporting hiker had a history of making false claims to law enforcement. The most heartbreaking false lead came from David Chen himself, who received a call from a woman claiming to have seen his daughters at a homeless encampment in downtown Seattle. The caller insisted that one of the women had specifically mentioned being from a hiking family and seemed to recognize Maya's name when it was mentioned on a news broadcast. David and Lynn drove to the location immediately, spending hours walking through the encampment and showing photographs to residents who tried to be helpful, but ultimately confirmed that no one matching their daughters' descriptions had been seen in the area. October brought a surge of reports triggered by a viral social media post that incorrectly suggested the sisters might have been victims of human trafficking. Tips flooded in from as far away as Los Angeles and Vancouver, each requiring investigation and follow-up that stretched Martinez's resources beyond their limits. A trucker reported seeing two women matching their description at a rest stop near Portland, leading to a coordinated effort involving Oregon State Police that ultimately proved fruitless. The most technically sophisticated false lead emerged when a YouTube user posted enhanced footage from a trail camera near Mount Rainier, claiming to show Maya and Sophia hiking together weeks after their disappearance. The video quality was poor, but digital enhancement seemed to reveal faces that bore a striking resemblance to the missing sisters. Martinez arranged for FBI video analysis specialists to examine the footage frame by frame. The enhanced analysis revealed the cruel truth that had become familiar over months of investigation. The two women in the video were indeed hiking together and superficially resembled Maya and Sophia, but careful examination of facial features, body proportions, and gait patterns proved conclusively that they were strangers who happened to share similar builds and hair colors with the Chen sisters. Each false lead followed the same emotional pattern for the Chen family. Initial excitement and hope would build as Martinez explained the potential breakthrough. David and Lynn would drop everything to assist with follow-up investigation, driving hundreds of miles or staying awake all night waiting for confirmation. The inevitable disappointment that followed each dead end was crushing, yet they could never bring themselves to ignore the next call that might finally bring their daughters home. Martinez developed a systematic approach to managing the overwhelming volume of tips, categorizing them by credibility and geographic relevance. Most could be dismissed quickly through basic fact-checking, but the promising leads required extensive investigation that consumed weeks of time and thousands of dollars in resources. The detective began to understand how missing persons cases could consume entire departments if not managed carefully. By November, the quality of tips had deteriorated significantly. Psychics called to offer visions of the sisters in various supernatural scenarios. Conspiracy theorists suggested elaborate cover-ups involving government agencies. Well-meaning but confused individuals reported seeing Maya and Sophia in contexts that made no logical sense, such as working in retail stores or attending college classes hundreds of miles from their last known location. The false leads took an unexpected psychological toll on everyone involved in the investigation. Each dead end represented not just wasted time and resources, but the destruction of hope that had to be rebuilt for the next potential breakthrough. Martinez found herself becoming cynical about public tips, a professional hazard that made her question legitimate leads that might have merit. The Chen family's relationship with hope became increasingly complicated as months passed without resolution. They learned to temper their expectations while still maintaining enough optimism to continue the search. The false leads had taught them that the gap between wanting to find their daughters and actually locating them might be impossible to bridge, but giving up was equally unthinkable. The morning of August 28, 2020, arrived gray and misty, matching the somber mood of the crowd gathering at the Sol Duc Hot Springs trailhead. Exactly 1 year had passed since Maya and Sophia Chen had signed their backcountry permit and disappeared into the Olympic wilderness, leaving behind only questions and a family forever changed by their absence. David Chen stood before the assembled group, his hands trembling slightly as he held the prepared speech he had written and rewritten dozens of times over the past week. Nearly 200 people had come to mark the anniversary, creating an unlikely community bound together by shared hope and frustration. Park rangers in their official uniforms stood beside volunteer searchers, still wearing muddy boots from weekend expeditions. Online forum moderators met face-to-face for the first time, their digital relationships suddenly made real by the gravity of the occasion. Maya and Sophia loved these mountains, David began, his voice carrying across the parking area where his daughters had taken their last known photographs. They came here seeking adventure and beauty, the same things that draw all of us to wild places. Today we gather not just to remember them, but to renew our commitment to finding answers. Lin Chen had chosen not to speak publicly, finding the weight of so many eyes and the pressure of expressing her grief in words too overwhelming to bear. She stood near the memorial display that volunteers had created, dozens of photographs showing Maya and Sophia at various hiking destinations over the years. The images captured their joy and vitality, making their absence feel even more profound and inexplicable. Detective Martinez watched the ceremony from the edge of the crowd, her presence both professional and personal. Over the past year, the Chen case had become more than just another investigation. She had grown to know the family intimately, sharing their frustration with each dead-end lead and false hope. The official search had been suspended months ago, but Martinez continued to follow up on tips and pursue new angles whenever possible. The formal ceremony included readings from other families who had lost loved ones in wilderness areas, creating a litany of grief that connected the Chen family to a larger community of people living with unanswered questions. A representative from the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System spoke about ongoing efforts to identify remains found in remote locations across the country, holding out the possibility that someday, science might provide the closure that searching had failed to deliver. But the most powerful moment came when Tommy Brewster, the park maintenance worker who had been among the last people to see Maya and Sophia alive, stepped forward unexpectedly. His voice was rough with emotion as he spoke about the guilt he carried over the conversation they had shared about hidden waterfalls and off-trail routes. "I keep thinking that maybe if I hadn't told them about those places, they would have stayed on the main trails where other hikers could have helped them if something went wrong," Brewster said. "I know it's not logical, but I can't stop wondering if I somehow pointed them toward whatever happened to them." David Chen immediately moved to comfort the maintenance worker, understanding that guilt was a burden that many people connected to the case carried unnecessarily. The search for someone to blame was natural but destructive, turning allies against each other when they should be working together to find the truth. As the official ceremony concluded, smaller groups formed throughout the parking area. Search teams planned their next volunteer expeditions. Online investigators shared theories and compared notes. Family members from other missing persons cases offered support and practical advice about navigating the complex emotions of prolonged uncertainty. The anniversary marking represented both an ending and a beginning. The first desperate year of searching was officially over, but the commitment to finding Maya and Sophia Chen remained as strong as ever. The case was being reclassified from active to cold status, a bureaucratic change that felt like a small death to the Chen family, but which Martinez assured them would not diminish ongoing investigative efforts. As the crowd dispersed and normal life resumed around them, David and Lin Chen faced the terrible prospect of beginning a second year of not knowing what had happened to their daughters. The anniversary had provided a moment of community and shared purpose, but it had also underscored the harsh reality that Maya and Sophia remained as missing as they had been 365 days earlier. The Olympic wilderness stretched endlessly beyond the trailhead, vast and silent, keeping its secrets as effectively as it had for the past year. The second year passed without answers, then the third, each anniversary at the Sol Duc trailhead, drawing smaller crowds as public attention moved on to newer tragedies and fresher mysteries. By 2022, the Chen family had learned to navigate a world where their daughters existed in a strange limbo between the living and the dead, present enough to cause daily pain but absent enough to make closure impossible. David had returned to work at the accounting firm, though his colleagues noticed the change in him. The man who had once been meticulous about spreadsheets and tax deadlines now seemed to drift through his professional responsibilities, his mind always partly elsewhere. He kept a small framed photo of Maya and Sophia on his desk, turning it face down during client meetings when the questions in their eyes became too much to bear. The Missing and Exploited Children's Foundation had approached the Chen family about establishing a non-profit organization to help other families navigate the complex bureaucracy of missing persons investigations. David threw himself into this work with the same obsessive energy he had once devoted to the search itself, finding purpose in helping other parents understand police procedures, coordinate volunteer efforts, and manage the media attention that could either help or hinder an investigation. Lin had chosen a different path through her grief. After taking early retirement from her nursing position, she enrolled in a counseling program specifically designed for families of missing persons. The weekly sessions forced her to confront the reality that Maya and Sophia might never come home, while also providing tools for living with uncertainty that she shared with other families facing similar situations. The online communities that had formed around the case gradually evolved from active investigation to memorial spaces. The Facebook groups still maintained thousands of members, but posts became less frequent and focused more on remembering the sisters than on generating new theories about their disappearance. Detective Martinez still received occasional tips through these channels, but most led to the same dead ends that had frustrated the official investigation for years. The most difficult transition was learning to live in their house without constantly expecting Maya and Sophia to walk through the front door. Lynn had initially preserved their bedrooms exactly as they had been left, but eventually recognized that the shrine-like atmosphere was preventing the family from processing their loss in healthy ways. With the help of her counselor, she gradually packed away personal items, donating clothes to charity while keeping a few meaningful objects that captured her daughter's personalities. David's relationship with the Olympic Peninsula had become complicated. The mountains that had once represented family adventure and shared joy now felt like the site of an unsolved crime. Yet he found himself returning to the trailheads regularly, not to search but simply to be in the place where his daughters had last been happy. These solo visits became a form of meditation, a way of maintaining connection with Maya and Sophia while accepting that some questions might never be answered. The 4th anniversary brought only immediate family to the Sol Duc parking area. The media had long since moved on, the volunteer search groups had disbanded, and even the most dedicated online investigators had begun focusing their attention on newer cases. Detective Martinez attended, as she had every year, bringing updates on advances in forensic technology that might someday be applied to cold cases like the Chen disappearance. As they stood together in the same spot where Maya and Sophia had begun their final hike, the Chen family faced the reality that their daughters had become part of the Olympic wilderness in ways they had never intended. The forest had absorbed them completely, leaving behind only memories and the terrible knowledge that some mysteries are too deep for human understanding to penetrate. The silence that had begun 4 years earlier with 2 missing phone calls had evolved into something larger and more permanent. It was no longer the absence of answers, but the presence of acceptance that some stories end without resolution. Some families learn to live with questions instead of conclusions, and some love persists, even when hope has been exhausted by time and disappointment. The Chen family was learning that healing doesn't always require closure, and that the human heart can be simultaneously broken and whole, devastated by loss while still capable of finding meaning in the mystery of what cannot be known. The renewed search effort began in spring of 2023, 4 years after Maya and Sophia Chen had vanished into the Olympic wilderness. What made this attempt different from previous operations was the technology that had become available to civilian search teams, equipment that had been restricted to military and commercial applications when the sisters first disappeared. Detective Martinez received the call from Marcus Webb, founder of Missing Persons Recovery Tech, a non-profit organization that specialized in applying advanced technology to cold cases. Webb's team had been following the Chen case through online forums and believed their new equipment might be able to search areas that had been inaccessible to previous ground teams. We're talking about thermal imaging drones that can penetrate forest canopy, ground-penetrating radar units light enough for backpack transport, and metal detectors sensitive enough to locate small personal items buried under years of leaf litter, Webb explained during his presentation to the Chen family and Olympic National Park officials. The technology exists now to search terrain that was impossible to cover thoroughly 4 years ago. The Park Service granted permission for a 2-week operation, with the understanding that Webb's team would work under official supervision and follow strict protocols to avoid disturbing sensitive wilderness areas. David Chen took vacation time to participate directly in the search, finally feeling that he was doing something concrete after years of helpless waiting. The drone operations began at Blue Lake, where Maya and Sophia's abandoned campsite had been discovered. Webb's team deployed sophisticated quadcopters, equipped with thermal imaging cameras capable of detecting temperature variations in soil that might indicate decomposition or buried objects. The drones could fly pre-programmed grid patterns, covering vast areas of forest floor that would take ground teams weeks to search manually. For 3 days, the drones mapped every square yard within a 5-mile radius of the campsite. The thermal imaging revealed numerous anomalies, hotspots that required ground teams to investigate on foot. Most turned out to be natural features, rocks heated by sunlight or small animal burrows, but each anomaly had to be carefully examined and ruled out. The ground-penetrating radar proved more promising. The portable units could be carried by single operators who walked systematic search patterns while the equipment scanned several feet below the surface. On the 4th day of the operation, The radar detected a metallic signature buried approximately 18 inches deep in a remote area 2 miles southwest of Blue Lake. David Chen was among the volunteers who hiked to the location, carrying shovels and evidence collection equipment. The buried object turned out to be an old camping pot, probably lost decades earlier by some forgotten backpacker. But the discovery proved that the technology could locate small metal items even after years of burial under forest debris. The most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Webb's team had been using aerial photography drones to create detailed maps of the search area when they discovered something that previous investigations had missed entirely. Hidden beneath the forest canopy, barely visible even from directly overhead, was a network of faint trails that didn't appear on any official park map. These unauthorized paths branched off from established hiking routes and disappeared into some of the most remote terrain in the Olympic Peninsula. Some appeared to be old game trails that had been modified and maintained by human activity. Others looked like they had been deliberately constructed to provide access to areas that were completely hidden from casual observation. Martinez immediately contacted park rangers about the trail network. The discovery raised troubling questions about who had created these hidden routes and why they led to areas so remote that most hikers would never stumble across them accidentally. Some of the trails terminated at natural clearings that showed signs of regular human use, including fire rings and makeshift shelters constructed from fallen timber. The search teams began following these unauthorized trails, mapping their routes and investigating the hidden campsites they connected. What they found was evidence of a long-term presence in the Olympic wilderness, someone or some group that had been using these remote areas for purposes that remained unclear. The 2-week search operation ended without finding any direct evidence of Maya and Sophia Chen, but it had revealed a hidden layer of human activity in the Olympic wilderness that previous investigations had never suspected. The technology that Webb's team had brought to the search had succeeded in uncovering new mysteries even as it failed to solve the original disappearance. Detective Martinez faced the difficult task of explaining to the Chen family that while the search had been unsuccessful in locating their daughters, it had opened new avenues of investigation that might eventually lead to answers. The Hidden Trail Network suggested that the Olympic wilderness was not as empty and pristine as most people believed, and that Maya and Sophia might have encountered something in those remote mountains that was never meant to be discovered. The discovery came on day 8 of the new search operation, when volunteer searcher Janet Morrison was following one of the unauthorized trails that the drone teams had identified. The narrow path wound through dense undergrowth for nearly 3 miles before emerging into a small clearing that had clearly been modified for human habitation. Morrison radioed her location to base camp, describing what appeared to be a long-term campsite hidden so deep in the Olympic wilderness that it would be invisible to all but the most determined searchers. Detective Martinez and Marcus Webb hiked to the site within 2 hours, bringing camera equipment and evidence collection supplies. The makeshift camp was unlike anything the search teams had encountered in their years of combing the Olympic Peninsula. A lean-to shelter constructed from fallen logs and salvaged tarps sat against a massive cedar tree, positioned to be invisible from above, while providing protection from the region's frequent rain. Fire rings made from carefully arranged stones showed evidence of regular use, with ash layers suggesting the site had been active for months or possibly years. Webb's team began documenting everything they found, photographing the shelter from multiple angles and creating detailed sketches of the camp's layout. Food caches had been created by hanging waterproof bags from high branches, a technique used by experienced backpackers to protect supplies from bears and other wildlife. The variety of preserved food suggested someone who understood long-term wilderness survival. The most intriguing discovery was a collection of personal items that had been carefully organized inside the shelter. Clothing in various sizes, both men's and women's garments, hung from improvised lines strung between trees. A small mirror had been wedged into the bark of the cedar tree, and basic toiletries were arranged on a flat stone that served as a makeshift washstand. Martinez examined a notebook that had been wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture. The pages contained handwritten entries in multiple handwriting styles, though the ink had faded and water damage made most of the text illegible. What she could decipher appeared to be a log of dates and brief notes about weather conditions, wildlife sightings, and supply runs. The camp showed signs of recent abandonment rather than long-term desertion. Fresh ashes in the fire ring suggested someone had been there within the past few weeks. Footprints around the shelter showed clear tread patterns from modern hiking boots, and the food caches still contained supplies that had not yet been damaged by weather or animals. Webb's metal detection equipment located several buried items around the perimeter of the camp. Most were common camping supplies, but one discovery sent a chill through the search team. Buried beneath a pile of stones near the shelter's entrance, they found a small digital camera wrapped in multiple layers of plastic bags. The camera's memory card contained dozens of photographs dating back over 2 years. Most showed wilderness scenes and wildlife, but several captured images of people moving through the forest. The photographs were taken from concealed positions, showing hikers on established trails who appeared unaware they were being observed. Martinez studied the images carefully, looking for any sign of Maya and Sophia Chen among the subjects. While she couldn't definitively identify the sisters in any of the photographs, several showed young women with backpacks who matched their general description and appearance. The implications were disturbing. Someone had been living in the Olympic wilderness for an extended period, maintaining hidden camps and apparently monitoring other hikers without their knowledge. The sophisticated nature of the concealment suggested extensive wilderness experience and possibly military or survival training. Park rangers immediately increased security patrols in the area, though the vastness of the Olympic Peninsula made comprehensive surveillance impossible. The discovery raised new questions about Maya and Sophia's disappearance, while failing to provide clear answers about their fate. Detective Martinez coordinated with federal authorities to analyze the camera and other evidence found at the site. The investigation was expanding beyond a simple missing persons case into something that potentially involved stalking, surveillance, and possibly worse crimes against visitors to the national park. The Chen family received updates about the discovery with mixed emotions. The evidence suggested their daughters might have encountered someone living rough in the wilderness, but it also raised terrifying possibilities about what might have happened during such an encounter. The hidden camp represented both a potential breakthrough and a new source of nightmares about Maya and Sophia's final days. The stranger in the woods remained as mysterious as ever, but the search teams now knew they were looking for someone who had turned the Olympic wilderness into their private domain, someone who watched others while remaining invisible themselves. The logging crew had been working the remote access road since dawn, their chainsaws and heavy machinery creating a constant rumble that echoed through the Olympic Peninsula's dense forest. It was November 15, 2024, 5 years and 3 months after Maya and Sophia Chen had vanished without explanation from their hiking trip. Jake Morrison, the crew foreman, was inspecting a section of damaged roadway when he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. At first he thought it was a deer or elk, common sights in this isolated area where wildlife rarely encountered humans. But the movement was wrong, too deliberate and upright to be an animal. A figure emerged from the tree line approximately 50 yards down the road, stumbling slightly as it moved from the soft forest floor onto the packed gravel surface. Morrison stopped his inspection and stared, hardly believing what he was seeing. It was a woman, clearly human but appearing almost feral after what must have been months or years of living rough in the wilderness. She was painfully thin, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had been reduced to little more than skin and bone. Her hair, dark and matted, fell past her shoulders in tangled strands that hadn't seen scissors or proper washing in what looked like years. Her face was deeply tanned and weathered, marked by exposure to sun and wind, but her eyes held an alertness that suggested she retained full awareness of her surroundings. Morrison called out to her, but she froze immediately, her body language shifting from exhausted relief to visible terror. She raised her hands in a defensive gesture, backing toward the forest edge as if preparing to flee back into the wilderness that had apparently sheltered her for so long. "It's okay," Morrison said, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening as he slowly approached. "We're just loggers. We're not going to hurt you. Do you need help?" The woman's response was barely audible, her voice hoarse from disuse and what sounded like years of speaking only to herself, or not at all. "Don't tell anyone you found me," she whispered, glancing nervously at the other crew members who had noticed the commotion and were moving in their direction. "Please, if you tell them, my family will be in danger." Morrison recognized the symptoms of severe trauma and psychological distress, but he also realized he might be looking at someone who had been missing for a very long time. "What's your name?" he asked gently, pulling out his cell phone to check for signal strength. "Are you lost? How long have you been out here?" "Sophia," she said, the single word barely escaping her lips before she collapsed to her knees on the gravel road. "My name is Sophia Chen. But you can't tell anyone. They'll kill my parents if they know I survived." Morrison's heart began pounding as he realized the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. The Chen sisters' disappearance had been major news throughout the Pacific Northwest, and their story remained one of the region's most famous unsolved mysteries. He was looking at someone who had presumably been dead for over 5 years, someone whose family had held memorial services and whose case had been relegated to cold file status. The other crew members gathered around as Morrison called 911, requesting immediate medical assistance and law enforcement response to their location. Sophia Chen remained on her knees in the gravel, her entire body shaking with exhaustion and what appeared to be overwhelming fear about being discovered after so many years of hiding. As they waited for emergency responders to arrive, Morrison tried to keep Sophia calm while gathering basic information about her condition. She refused to explain where she had been or what had happened to her sister Maya, speaking only in fragmented whispers about dangers in the forest and people who would do anything to protect their secrets. The ambulance arrived within 40 minutes, followed closely by sheriff's deputies and Detective Martinez, who had been notified immediately about the discovery. As paramedics began treating Sophia for severe malnutrition and exposure, Martinez faced the overwhelming task of processing what appeared to be the return of someone who had been presumed dead, carrying secrets that might finally explain one of the Olympic Peninsula's greatest mysteries. Sophia Chen had returned from the wilderness, but her terror suggested that the true horror of what had happened to her and her sister was only beginning to be revealed. Olympic Medical Center's emergency department had seen many unusual cases over the years, but nothing quite like Sophia Chen. Dr. Rachel Kim, the attending physician, had been briefed about the patient's identity during the ambulance transport, giving her time to prepare for what promised to be both a medical and psychological challenge of extraordinary complexity. Sophia's vital signs told the story of prolonged survival under extreme conditions. Her weight had dropped to barely 90 pounds, at least 30 pounds below what medical records indicated was normal for her height and build. Blood tests revealed severe malnutrition, dehydration, and vitamin deficiencies consistent with years of inadequate nutrition. Her skin showed multiple scars from untreated cuts and injuries, evidence of the harsh reality of wilderness survival, but the physical damage was nothing compared to the psychological trauma that became apparent during the initial examination. Sophia flinched at unexpected sounds, kept her back to walls whenever possible, and spoke only in whispers when she spoke at all. Her eyes constantly scanned the room, as if searching for escape routes or hidden threats. Detective Martinez arrived at the hospital within 2 hours of Sophia's admission, accompanied by Dr. Patricia Valdez, a trauma counselor who specialized in working with victims of prolonged captivity and abuse. They understood that rushing the interview process could re-traumatize Sophia or cause her to withdraw completely, potentially losing the only chance to learn what had happened during her 5-year absence. David and Lynn Chen reached the hospital by evening, having driven straight from Seattle after receiving Martinez's call. Their reunion with their daughter was heartbreaking in its complexity. Sophia recognized them immediately but seemed almost afraid of their emotional response, as if their joy and relief were somehow dangerous to acknowledge. "She's not the same person who went hiking 5 years ago," Dr. Kim explained to the family during a private consultation. "The psychological impact of whatever she experienced has fundamentally changed how she processes information and relates to other people. We need to be patient and let her tell us what happened at her own pace." The breakthrough came on Sophia's 3rd night in the hospital, during a quiet conversation with Dr. Valdez in the dimly lit patient room. Something about the controlled environment and the trauma counselor's gentle questioning finally allowed Sophia to begin speaking about her ordeal. "Maya saved me," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible even in the silence of the hospital room. "She fought them so I could run. She told me to hide and never come back. Never let them know I survived." Dr. Valdez carefully encouraged Sophia to continue, understanding that these first revelations might be the only chance to learn the truth about what had happened to both sisters. "Who did Maya fight? Who were you hiding from?" Sophia's response sent chills through everyone present. "The people in the forest. They have camps everywhere, hidden places where they do things that nobody's supposed to see. Maya and I found one of their operations, and they couldn't let us leave with that knowledge." The implications were staggering. Sophia was describing not a random encounter with a single dangerous individual, but contact with an organized group operating in the Olympic wilderness. Her terror about being discovered suggested that this group was still active, still posed a threat, and had resources sufficient to monitor and potentially harm anyone who threatened their security. Detective Martinez realized she was no longer investigating a simple missing persons case or even an isolated crime of opportunity. Sophia Chen had returned from 5 years in hiding with evidence of criminal activity on a scale that would require federal law enforcement involvement and resources far beyond what local authorities could provide. Dr. Valdez gently probed for more details, but Sophia's responses became increasingly fragmented and fearful. She spoke about living in hidden camps, moving constantly to avoid detection, and learning survival skills that had kept her alive while Maya's sacrifice had kept their secret safe. The most heartbreaking moment came when Sophia asked if her parents would be safe now that she had been discovered. The question revealed the terrible burden she had carried for 5 years, believing that her survival depended on remaining hidden and that revealing herself would endanger everyone she loved. As the medical team worked to stabilize Sophia's physical condition, Detective Martinez began the complex process of organizing an investigation into criminal activities that had apparently been operating undetected in Olympic National Park for years. Sophia Chen had returned from the wilderness, but she had brought with her evidence of secrets that powerful people had been willing to kill to protect. The silence that had surrounded Maya and Sophia's disappearance was finally being broken, but the truth it revealed was more disturbing than anyone had imagined possible. The private room at Olympic Medical Center felt like a sanctuary compared to the wilderness where Sophia Chen had survived for 5 years, but even here she kept the curtains drawn and positioned herself where she could see both the door and window. Detective Martinez sat across from her, accompanied by Dr. Valdez and FBI Special Agent Catherine Torres, who had been called in when the scope of Sophia's revelations became clear. It had taken 6 days of careful preparation before Sophia felt safe enough to tell her complete story. The medical team had stabilized her physical condition, and Dr. Valdez had established enough trust to begin extracting the terrible details of what had happened in the Olympic wilderness. Maya and I were supposed to hike back to the trailhead on our 3rd day, Sophia began, her voice still barely above a whisper. But we heard about a hidden waterfall from another hiker, something not marked on any map. Maya wanted to photograph it before we left. The detour had led them far from established trails, following game paths and creek beds deeper into the Olympic Peninsula's most remote terrain. What they discovered was not a waterfall but something far more sinister hidden in a valley that couldn't be seen from any official hiking route. There were buildings, Sophia continued, her hands trembling as she spoke. Not like Park Service structures, but big metal buildings with generators and vehicles. People in camouflage clothing were moving boxes and equipment. There were armed guards posted around the perimeter. Agent Torres leaned forward, recognizing the description of a sophisticated illegal operation. What kind of equipment did you see? Can you describe the vehicles? Sophia closed her eyes, clearly struggling to revisit the memories. Trucks with no license plates. Chemical equipment that looked like laboratory gear. And plants. Lots of plants growing under artificial lights inside the buildings. Maya took photos with her camera before we realized how dangerous it was. The sisters had stumbled onto what appeared to be a large-scale drug manufacturing operation, hidden so deep in the wilderness that it could operate undetected by law enforcement. But their presence had not gone unnoticed by the operation's security personnel. They caught us trying to leave, Sophia said, tears beginning to flow for the first time since her rescue. Men with guns surrounded us before we could get back to the main trail. They took our phones, our camera, everything. They said they couldn't let us leave with what we'd seen. What followed was a nightmare that had lasted for days. The sisters were held captive while the operation's leaders decided what to do with witnesses who could expose their hidden empire. Maya, as the older sister, had taken responsibility for their situation and tried to negotiate their release. Maya told them we wouldn't say anything, that we just wanted to go home, Sophia whispered. But they said it was too big a risk. They were talking about making us disappear permanently. The escape attempt had been Maya's idea, a desperate plan that required one sister to sacrifice herself so the other could survive to eventually tell the truth. During a moment when their guards were distracted, Maya had attacked the men holding them, creating enough chaos for Sophia to run into the forest. She screamed at me to keep running and never come back, Sophia said, her voice breaking completely. She said someone had to survive to expose what we'd found, but it couldn't be both of us. I heard gunshots behind me, but I kept running like she told me to. Agent Torres felt a chill as she realized the implications of Sophia's account. A criminal organization operating in Olympic National Park had murdered Maya Chen to protect their secret and had been hunting Sophia for 5 years to eliminate the only remaining witness to their activities. How did you survive alone for so long? Dr. Valdez asked gently. Sophia's response revealed the incredible resilience and resourcefulness that had kept her alive while living as a fugitive in the wilderness. She had used survival skills learned from her father's military background, moving constantly between hidden camps, foraging for food, and avoiding any contact with other hikers who might inadvertently reveal her location. I knew they were still looking for me, she explained. I saw their search parties in the forest, heard their vehicles on remote roads. I had to stay hidden until I was sure it was safe, until I knew my family wouldn't be hurt if I came forward. Detective Martinez realized that Sophia Chen had not simply survived in the wilderness. She had been conducting her own 5-year investigation into the criminal operation that had killed her sister. Her return represented not just the resolution of a missing persons case, but the beginning of what would likely be the largest criminal investigation in Olympic National Park's history. The terrible secret that Maya and Sophia had discovered was finally being revealed, but the cost of that knowledge had been 5 years of Sophia's life and Maya's death. The question now was whether law enforcement could act on Sophia's information quickly enough to prevent the criminals from disappearing back into the wilderness that had hidden them so effectively for so long. The coordinates Sophia provided led the multi-agency task force to a remote valley in the Olympic Peninsula that appeared on no hiking map and could only be accessed through a network of abandoned logging roads dating back to the 1970s. Agent Torres coordinated the operation from a command post established 15 miles from the target location, far enough away to avoid detection, but close enough to provide rapid response support. The reconnaissance team deployed before dawn on December 3, 2024, using night vision equipment and thermal imaging to approach the hidden facility without triggering any security measures. What they discovered exceeded even the most aggressive estimates of the operation's scope and sophistication. The main compound occupied nearly 10 acres of forest that had been carefully cleared and camouflaged to remain invisible from aerial surveillance. 3 large metal buildings served as the core of the operation, surrounded by smaller structures that appeared to house generators, storage facilities, and living quarters for personnel. Solar panels hidden beneath artificial tree canopies provided supplemental power to the diesel generators that kept the facility running around the clock. Special Agent Mike Rodriguez, leading the reconnaissance team, radioed back details that painted a picture of criminal enterprise on an industrial scale. "We're looking at a fully operational manufacturing facility," he reported. "Multiple buildings with sophisticated ventilation systems, laboratory-grade equipment, and security measures that include motion sensors and armed guards on rotating patrols." The drug manufacturing operation was far more complex than anything law enforcement had encountered in the Pacific Northwest. The facility appeared capable of producing multiple types of illegal substances, from traditional methamphetamines to newer synthetic drugs that were flooding urban markets. Chemical precursors were stored in quantities that suggested production capabilities worth millions of dollars annually. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence that the operation had been active for far longer than anyone had suspected. Equipment showed signs of years of continuous use, and waste disposal sites indicated that production had been ongoing since at least 2015. The criminal organization had successfully hidden their activities in the Olympic wilderness for nearly a decade. The surveillance operation revealed approximately 20 people working at the facility during any given shift, with additional personnel rotating in and out via the network of hidden access roads. The organization's security measures included encrypted communications equipment, multiple escape routes through the forest, and contingency plans for rapidly destroying evidence if the facility was discovered. Agent Torres realized they were dealing with more than a simple drug manufacturing operation. The level of organization, the sophisticated security measures, and the long-term nature of the facility suggested connections to larger criminal networks that extended far beyond the Olympic Peninsula. Phone intercepts revealed communications with contacts in Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver, indicating distribution networks that reached throughout the Pacific Northwest. The task force faced a complex tactical challenge. The facility's remote location meant that any assault would have to be coordinated carefully to prevent the destruction of evidence and the escape of key personnel. The multiple escape routes through dense forest could allow suspects to disappear into wilderness areas where tracking would be nearly impossible. More troubling was the realization that Maya Chen's murder was likely not the only violence associated with the operation. Security personnel were heavily armed, and surveillance indicated that the organization had established protocols for dealing with potential witnesses or security threats. Sophia's 5-year survival in hiding had prevented additional murders, but other hikers who had stumbled onto the operation might not have been as fortunate. The evidence collected during the reconnaissance operation confirmed Sophia's account in terrifying detail. Investigators found abandoned campsites that matched her descriptions of places where she had hidden during her years in the wilderness. They also discovered surveillance equipment that the criminal organization had used to monitor hiking trails and track potential threats to their security. Agent Torres coordinated with federal prosecutors to prepare arrest warrants for the operation's leadership, while tactical teams planned the assault that would shut down the facility and arrest everyone involved. The investigation that had begun with 2 missing hikers had evolved into one of the largest federal crime operations in the history of Olympic National Park. The hidden valley that had concealed the criminal operation for so many years was about to be exposed, but the cost of that discovery continued to mount. Maya Chen had died trying to protect her sister and expose the truth, while Sophia had sacrificed 5 years of her life living as a fugitive to ensure that justice would eventually be served. The terrible secret that the sisters had discovered was finally being revealed in its full scope, but the investigation was also uncovering evidence of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity in one of America's most treasured wilderness areas, protected by isolation and willing to use deadly force against anyone who threatened their operation. The coordinates that Sophia had memorized during her escape led the search team to a steep ravine approximately 3 miles northwest of the hidden drug facility. Agent Torres and Detective Martinez followed Park Ranger Tom Mitchell down a treacherous slope that required rappelling equipment to navigate safely, the terrain so difficult that previous search operations had never been able to access the area thoroughly. The ravine was a natural tomb, hidden beneath a canopy of old-growth trees that blocked most sunlight from reaching the forest floor. Water from seasonal runoff had carved deep channels through the rocky terrain, creating a maze of crevices and hidden spaces where evidence could remain undisturbed for years. Martinez spotted the first indication that they were in the right location when her flashlight illuminated a piece of blue fabric caught on a branch approximately 50 feet down the ravine wall. The color matched the hiking shirt that Maya Chen had been wearing in her final social media post, and the fabric showed weathering consistent with 5 years of exposure to Pacific Northwest weather. The recovery operation required specialized equipment and techniques normally used for mountain rescue operations. Crime scene technicians had to be lowered into the ravine on cables, their equipment secured in waterproof containers to protect evidence from the moisture that constantly seeped through the rocky walls. Maya's remains were found in a narrow crevice at the bottom of the ravine, partially concealed by fallen rocks and debris that had accumulated over the years since her death. The skeletal remains showed clear evidence of trauma consistent with Sophia's account of the violent confrontation that had allowed her to escape from their captors. Dr. Rebecca Foster, the forensic anthropologist assigned to examine the remains, worked carefully to document every detail of the recovery site. Her preliminary findings painted a grim picture of Maya's final moments and confirmed the sisters' heroic sacrifice to save Sophia's life. The victim sustained multiple blunt force trauma injuries to the skull and torso, Dr. Foster reported to the assembled investigators. The pattern of injuries suggests a prolonged physical altercation, consistent with someone fighting desperately against multiple attackers. There's also evidence of a gunshot wound to the chest area. Personal items found with Maya's remains provided additional confirmation of her identity and helped reconstruct the events leading to her death. Her hiking boots were still laced, suggesting she had been walking normally when the attack occurred. Her camera, damaged but recoverable, was found nearby in a waterproof case that had protected the memory card containing the final photographs she had taken of the hidden drug operation. The photographs on Maya's camera were devastating evidence of the criminal enterprise that had cost her life. Clear images showed the manufacturing facility, armed personnel, and chemical equipment that proved the scope of the illegal operation. Maya had managed to document everything Sophia had described, creating a photographic record that would be crucial to prosecuting those responsible for her murder. Agent Torres studied the camera's metadata, which revealed that the final photographs had been taken on August 26, 2019, just 2 days after Maya and Sophia had begun their hiking trip. The timeline confirmed that the sisters had discovered the drug operation early in their planned adventure and had been captured while attempting to leave the area with evidence of what they had found. The location where Maya's body was discovered was approximately 2 miles from the hidden facility, suggesting that she had been killed during the escape attempt, and her body disposed of in the ravine to prevent its discovery. The remote location and difficult terrain had protected the crime scene for 5 years, preserving evidence that would have been destroyed in a more accessible area. Detective Martinez felt a profound sadness as she watched the careful recovery of Maya's remains. The young woman had died trying to protect her sister and expose criminal activity that had operated with impunity in the Olympic wilderness. Her sacrifice had saved Sophia's life, and ultimately led to the discovery of one of the largest drug manufacturing operations in Pacific Northwest history. The recovery operation also located additional evidence that suggested Maya and Sophia were not the only victims of the criminal organization's violence. Personal items from other hikers, including identification cards and camping equipment, were found scattered throughout the ravine, indicating that other people who had stumbled onto the hidden operation might have met similar fates. Dr. Foster's detailed examination of Maya's remains would take weeks to complete, but her preliminary findings provided enough evidence to support murder charges against the individuals who had been arrested during the raid on the drug facility. Maya Chen's death was finally being recognized as the violent crime it had always been, rather than a wilderness accident or unexplained disappearance. The ravine that had hidden Maya's remains for 5 years was yielding its secrets, but each discovery reinforced the terrible cost of the criminal enterprise that had operated in the Olympic wilderness. Maya's courage in fighting to save her sister had ultimately led to justice, but it had also revealed the extent of violence that powerful people were willing to use to protect their criminal empire. The federal courthouse in Seattle had rarely seen a case that captured public attention like the prosecution of the Olympic Peninsula drug conspiracy. By January 2025, the investigation had expanded far beyond the hidden manufacturing facility to expose a criminal network that had operated with shocking impunity across multiple states and international borders. U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh stood before a packed courtroom to announce indictments against 23 individuals, including several who had held positions of trust within law enforcement and Park Service agencies. The conspiracy charges painted a picture of systematic corruption that had allowed the drug operation to flourish undetected for nearly a decade. The evidence will show that this criminal organization murdered Maya Chen to protect their illegal activities, Walsh announced during her opening statement. They then spent 5 years hunting her sister Sophia, intending to eliminate the only witness who could expose their crimes. The lead defendants included Marcus Daniels, who had operated the hidden facility, and his lieutenant Robert Hayes, who had been directly involved in Maya's murder. But the most shocking arrests were of individuals who had used their official positions to protect the criminal enterprise from detection and investigation. Park Ranger Dennis Crawford had been feeding information about search and rescue operations to the drug organization, allowing them to move equipment and personnel whenever law enforcement activities came too close to their hidden facility. His inside knowledge had been crucial to the operation's ability to avoid detection during the initial search for Maya and Sophia. Detective Ray Kowalski of the Clallam County Sheriff's Office had actively sabotaged the original missing persons investigation, misdirecting search efforts away from areas where the criminal organization was active. His interference had prevented searchers from discovering the hidden facility when it might have been possible to rescue both sisters. Agent Torres testified about the sophisticated nature of the criminal enterprise, describing how the organization had recruited corrupt officials and established multiple layers of protection for their operations. This was not a simple drug manufacturing case, she explained to the jury. This was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local law enforcement and federal agencies. The evidence presented during the trial revealed the true scope of the criminal network's activities. Financial records showed that the Olympic Peninsula facility had generated over $50 million in revenue during its years of operation. Drug distribution networks extended from Vancouver to Los Angeles, with connections to international trafficking organizations in Mexico and Asia. Sophia Chen's testimony was the prosecution's most powerful evidence, but also its most difficult moment. She had spent months preparing with victim advocates to face the men who had murdered her sister and destroyed her life. Her quiet, steady recounting of Maya's heroic sacrifice and her own 5 years of survival in hiding moved several jurors to tears. Maya told me to run and never stop running until I could find someone who would listen to the truth, Sophia testified. She died so that someday justice could be served for what these people did. The defense attempted to portray the sisters as drug users who had been involved with the criminal organization voluntarily, but Maya's camera provided irrefutable evidence that they had stumbled onto the facility accidentally and attempted to document it for law enforcement. The photographs showed clearly that the sisters had been trying to gather evidence rather than participate in criminal activities. The corruption aspects of the case drew intense media attention as details emerged about how the criminal organization had recruited and maintained their network of corrupt officials. Bribes, threats, and blackmail had been used systematically to compromise individuals in positions that could protect or advance the operation's interests. Detective Martinez, whose honest investigation had ultimately exposed the conspiracy, testified about the subtle ways that information had been withheld or misdirected during the original search for the Chen sisters. I kept feeling like we were being steered away from certain areas, she recalled. Now I understand that some of my own colleagues were actively working against the investigation. The trial lasted 4 months, with testimony from over 100 witnesses, including Sophia, law enforcement officials, forensic experts, and former associates of the criminal organization who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. The evidence presented painted a comprehensive picture of how the drug conspiracy had operated and the extreme measures they had taken to protect their secrets. When the verdicts were announced in May 2025, all 23 defendants were found guilty on multiple charges, including conspiracy, drug trafficking, murder, and racketeering. Marcus Daniels and Robert Hayes received life sentences without possibility of parole for Maya's murder. The corrupt officials received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years in federal prison. The Chen family sat in the front row as the verdicts were read, finally seeing justice served for Maya's death and Sophia's suffering. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful and untouchable had been dismantled through Sophia's courage and the dedication of honest law enforcement officials who refused to accept corruption. But even as justice was served, the full cost of the criminal organization's activities continued to emerge. Investigators had identified at least 6 other hikers who had disappeared in the Olympic Peninsula during the years the drug operation was active. suggesting that Maya and Sophia were not the only victims of violence used to protect the conspiracy's secrets. The morning of September 15, 2027, dawned clear and crisp in the Cascade foothills, where Reslon Memorial Park overlooked the distant peaks of the Olympic Peninsula. Nearly 300 people had gathered for Maya Chen's funeral, a ceremony that had been delayed for 8 years while her family searched for answers, and her remains waited in a forensic laboratory for justice to be served. Sophia Chen stood at the podium overlooking the assembled mourners, her transformation from the terrified survivor who had emerged from the wilderness 3 years earlier remarkable in its completeness. Intensive therapy, the support of her family, and the resolution of her sister's case had allowed her to reclaim much of the life that had been stolen from her during those 5 years of hiding in the Olympic wilderness. Maya always said that mountains teach you who you really are, Sophia began, her voice steady and clear as it carried across the cemetery. She believed that wilderness strips away everything fake and shows you what matters most. Maya discovered that what mattered most to her was protecting the people she loved, even when that protection required the ultimate sacrifice. David and Lin Chen sat in the front row, their faces showing the complex emotions of parents who had finally been able to lay their daughter to rest while celebrating the survival of another. The years since Sophia's return had been filled with healing and rebuilding, but also with the difficult process of integrating the terrible truth of what had happened to their family into a narrative they could live with. The memorial service drew attendees from across the spectrum of people whose lives had been touched by the Chen sisters' story. Detective Martinez sat with her current partner, reflecting on how the case had changed her approach to missing persons investigations and her understanding of the corruption that could hide in plain sight. Agent Torres had flown in from her new assignment in Washington, D.C., where she now led a federal task force focused on criminal activities in national parks. Several survivors of the drug conspiracy attended the service, including former park employees who had been intimidated into silence during the criminal organization's years of operation. Their presence represented a form of collective healing for a community that had been infected by corruption and violence operating beneath the surface of their daily lives. The most moving tribute came from Tommy Brewster, the park maintenance worker who had spent 8 years blaming himself for directing Maya and Sophia toward the remote areas where they had encountered the drug operation. His guilt had been transformed into advocacy for wilderness safety and transparency in law enforcement, work that he credited with helping him find meaning in the tragedy. Dr. Patricia Valdez, the trauma counselor who had helped Sophia process her ordeal, spoke about the remarkable resilience that had allowed a young woman to survive 5 years of isolation while maintaining her sanity and sense of purpose. Sophia's story reminds us that the human spirit can endure almost anything when it's sustained by love and the determination to see justice served. As the formal ceremony concluded, smaller groups gathered throughout the cemetery to share memories and continue conversations that had begun during the long years of searching for answers. The online communities that had formed around the case had evolved into lasting friendships, with people who had never met in person becoming extended family members, united by their commitment to finding the truth. Sophia's closing remarks captured the complex legacy of her sister's death and her own survival. Maya's life was cut short by evil people who thought they could hide their crimes in the wilderness, she said. But her death exposed that evil and led to justice for victims whose families never stopped looking for answers. She died protecting me, but she also died protecting every hiker who will be safer because these criminals can never hurt anyone again. The Chen family had established a foundation dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and improving safety protocols in national parks. The work provided purpose and meaning to their grief while ensuring that Maya's sacrifice would continue to protect others long into the future. As the mourners departed, and the cemetery returned to its peaceful silence, the Olympic Mountains stood distant but visible on the horizon. The wilderness that had taken Maya's life and hidden Sophia for 5 years remained as beautiful and dangerous as ever, but it could no longer conceal the truth about what had happened in its deepest valleys. Maya Chen had finally come home, not as the vibrant young woman who had set out on a hiking adventure 8 years earlier, but as a symbol of courage and sacrifice, whose legacy would endure long after the mountains themselves had been worn down by time and weather. The silence that had surrounded her disappearance had been replaced by the permanent echo of truth, justice, and the unbreakable bonds of family love that transcend even death itself.